And one thing that was interesting, and I noticed it when the A's, when they were making their wild card runs a few years back, you would see ESPN pop up. And I don't want to say out of nowhere, that's just how the coverage goes. And you mentioned it a little bit. How do you make local fans happy when you're on a national broadcast, or is that possible?
I think it's possible, but never fully. Not everybody, is going to be happy about it. And part of that is just they're going to come in saying, I don't care. I don't care who it is. I don't care which broadcaster it is. I don't like them. That's
right.
How some people are going to be. And it's more prevalent in baseball than any other sport. And the reason is obvious. It's pure volume. It's pure numbers. It's twice the length of a hockey or basketball season. And the games typically, although obviously this year that it changed a little bit, but still for the most part, the games are longer. So you are just straight up spending more time with your broadcast team. And no matter what, you will not make the entire local market happy. And that's something you just kind of have to accept as a national baseball announcer. Now, the ways that I feel like I've worked to mitigate that somewhat, I think we have a tendency on the national side to go too big picture. And I think the more kind of local we can make it feel, especially like game to game, I think the better off we are. And again, our job, frankly, if we prepare properly and research properly, I think the national baseball job is a little bit easier because we're not deep diving on every single aspect of the organization. But the big thing for me is to try to be as recent as possible. And you were asking about process earlier, Jess, and I've changed my baseball process the last couple of years to really try to focus in on during the regular season, at least on that week. What's happening that week and the prior week. What's really happened the last 3 or 4 series, because that's the stuff that's freshest in the minds of local fans too. And then if you can connect those dots to some of the overarching storylines that a team comes in with at the beginning of the season, then great. But you're never going to know as much as the local people do, obviously. And again, I know that I am a local guy. So I see it. I see fans of the Bulls complaining when they are on national TV. Well, this broadcast doesn't know or whatever. And I'm like, guys, it's just not the same. It's not that's the point. It's supposed to be the national perspective. I think the one thing that upsets me is the word bias. I think that's what frustrates me as a national broadcaster.
I was going to ask you about that too. It's something that your job as a national broadcaster when it comes to being biased or unbiased.
Yeah. And I think as I've thought about these things more often, I've come to realize that there is no such thing as an objective broadcast, because the game itself is not objective, especially when you're only coming in for one. You're coming in for that one game, you're parachuting in, or even just for that one series. You're just covering the ebbs and flows of that day and of that series. You're not there to frame everything in the perspective of, like we did Astros Twins. It's not my job to frame everything in the perspective of an Astros fan who, when they watch Todd and Blummer on, a Tuesday in June, everything is framed in the context of, well, how does this affect the team that you watch 150 times a year, 140 times, 130 times with your broadcast crew? Like, that's their job. They're doing their job properly. And we're trying to do our job properly by just covering the ebbs and flows of what happens that day. And when it is 1 out of 162, or it does get boiled down to a 5 or 7 game series, it's really hard to convince people that, well, you're not biased against the team. I am biased towards the score and towards the waves of the game. If a team is playing really, really well, we're probably going to talk about them. If a team has 7 batters come up in 4 out of the 9 innings that they're up at the plate, of course the game's going to be biased, because the time that we're going to spend talking about that is going to be significantly more than the time we spend talking about the other team, because they're not on offense. They're not bringing up multiple players that we can discuss and connect dots to for story after story. It just doesn't happen. That's how the game gets covered when you're coming in from that parachuting perspective. And it's hard for fans, and it's not their job to know this, but it's hard for fans to contextualize that. And I can appreciate that. It gets a little bit frustrating when I keep explaining myself. But when I do explain myself, I think fans do understand it. I've interacted with people and said, hey, I get where you're coming from. Here's why it sounds this way. I gave you the psychological reason because of your connectivity to your own broadcast team, and I gave you the mechanical reason for us just covering what happens in those particular 9 innings or those 45 innings in a 5-game series. That's how we have to do the job.
So it sounds like they're embracing that.
I think you have to, you know,
Yeah.
and again, like you said, to appeal to the local market, you try as much as you can to literally fall into the bushes that, you know, you're advancing through over the course of that season. You know, that field that you're advancing through that season, you try to plop yourself right in that spot, you know, between game 140 and 142.
Yeah.
You're there for game 141. I will try to give you as much as I can as to what's happened from game 130 to game 140, because that's what you're probably thinking about most. And I'll try to connect it to the beginning of the year as best as we can, but trying to keep it where the game is at. It's a little bit different for baseball than it is for football or jumping in on an NBA broadcast in the national scope.
It always makes you think there's a wild card game, and I look up and there's an ESPN flag. A-Rod's next to me. Buster Olney's talking to Bo Mel, and I'm like, where were you guys all season? Where were you during June when like all the guys were crying? And then after I let that go, and then I started being part of national broadcast, I understood it. And you don't want to be phony, right? As somebody who's covering a different game, because you have to understand where they're coming from. But I'm glad that they're embracing it.